about life at the AA, let's say in a more informal, unstructured way, which will try and answer the question that we parodied a couple of years ago with this bag, what we talk about when we talk about the AA, which is, for those of you that read the works of people like Raymond Carver, a transposition on a famous book that he wrote. And what I've done to that front is put together a couple hundred pictures, very subjective, to try and answer that sort of question, which is really trying to answer the question of what the heck is that? Which, as I was walking up here today, sorry, I've got a few props here on this side I'll share with you over the next hour, but which is one of about 35,000 drawings or images made in this school last year, which has just come out a couple of days ago on the cover of Blueprint magazine, and they're very thick pick of graduate shows for 2014. I'm not going to explain that image and that project. That's Zon's job, who graduated last June and will be back to show it, I'm sure, soon so that he can explain it. What I would like to shift your focus on for the next few minutes is away from funny images and funny projects, of which we have plenty, you'll see in a minute, to what I think is the more interesting question for a school of architecture, which is the question of what the figure of the architect is today, or should be, at the short end of a very long and very weird century that will be your home for the next several decades, and which is already changing in ways so staggeringly complex and unpredictable that we know as a school our job is to prepare you in a very different way for shaping the kind of careers that, like this one, will go on to impact architecture as it's both taught and built for many years to come. This picture I took a few years ago, staring at these funny buildings that you walked into this morning. This is our reconstruction of a project that was first realized in 1974. For extra credit, can anyone name the architect? Go ahead. Can anyone name the architect of this stuff up here? It's a young AA tutor named Bernard Schumi, who treats this as his first architectural project, and for that reason alone, we invited him back in as part of a show that I curated a few years ago called First Works, in which that generation of architects presented to a new generation today what architecture once thought itself to be. It's a fireworks display, obviously. Wasn't an easy thing to put together to get permission from the estate to launch it off of the roof of this building. I'm going to touch briefly on that project later, along with a few others of that time. But what I'm interested in more than anything is the discomfort that you need to get over of this place not looking like an architecture school any more than it does. Just as many of the projects here don't look on their surface like architecture. Our school will often look like a place where we just blow stuff up, which we do, regularly and usually with great satisfaction. I took that picture a few years ago of a project we did out in the courtyard. It's also a place where we cut a lot of stuff apart to see what we learned. This is the 10-ton concrete model we built in a gallery in Istanbul a few years ago as part of a visiting school there, in which the students who had designed and tested this sort of liquefied concrete material were gaining as much out of the tearing apart of it as they did by first assembling it over several weeks in that gallery. The most important point, I would say, and I think one of the deep-seated beliefs of this school, is that you will learn to become an architect by doing architecture. As I said earlier, a little while ago, we're not going to tell you how to do it, partly because we don't know. Certainly don't want you to do it in the forms that we already know it, but that more than anything, we understand a discipline like architecture, like art and so many other fields, depends in its life on your ability to reconfigure that idea of the architect out of which architectural ideas emerge. So what I'm going to talk about today is the role of the architect as a kind of project in your lives. By the way, one of my pedagogical heroes, that is Andy Warhol, hard at work in his studio in New York, in a place that he renamed the Factory for very strange reasons in the 1960s. My favorite part of the image by far, this dumbbell underneath his coffee table where Andy would work out quite vigorously every day. he was challenging the idea by the middle of the 20th century about what a modern architect should be. You're going to find many iterations of that in a building like this in relation to architecture. But the important point is that quote that I had up just a minute ago, which is that it will be your project to configure that figure, to make the architect in new and unexpected ways. The figure of the architect as we know him, and it's been largely a him story for hundreds of years, which thankfully has begun changing in the 20th and now early 21st century, is, in these kind of portraits, a construction. And that's the first thing to get your head around, that construction of the figure of the architect, which is what I'll try and draw your attention to in a first few set of images before I go into our vocabulary of funny words at the school. As Nietzsche said, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, that construction we make of ourselves does become us in our lives. And I've pulled out some images of the way in which architects in this place over the years have both constructed and played with that figure we think we know. This is an AA diploma tutor who some of you would have seen this afternoon putting on the mask of her boss at the time 10 years ago when she was working in that office with one of Rem's partners. Students here wear a lot of masks, but not to hide themselves. They're not trying to hide the world they think they know from a world we can see. What they really do is experimenting with what it means to learn architecture, again, by literally tearing holes in the wall. This is Rory and Josh 2 years ago in that back small room here as we punched a hole through onto the terrace so that they and their students in an intermediate unit could start to build an addition that we'll be putting on the top of those two buildings. That kind of activity for 30 or more years has been going on in many new and weird ways around the AA. This is a young AA tutor in 1974. As he has graduated, standing next to his tutor, who you all will get a chance to meet in November when he comes back to the AA to lead a workshop that we've organized for Open Week, Ilya Zengelis, Rem Koolhaus, and their partners at the time, Zoe Zengelis and Madeline Vriesendorp, both of whom were teachers of mine in this room in the 1980s, teaching media studies. And the most interesting feature of that period is the way in which those people came together to form a practice. Not to do a project, but literally to form that thing many of you will already know is called OMA, the Office of Metropolitan Architecture. That picture I just showed you was made 2 years after this funny little booklet, which sits up in my office, which any of you are welcome to come by and have a look at. This is Rem Koolhaus's fifth-year portfolio in this building. It is thinner than most of your history and theory submissions that will be done this autumn. One of its most stunning features is that this is Madeline's work on one side. She was the only one that could draw in that group. And Rem wrote a few things on this side. And they put it together into a little book that some of you might already know called Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture. It's a lovely allegorical story about the way the modern city was changing in the 1970s. Quite a strange kind of fantasy tale, one of many that those authors worked on. But its most interesting feature, and what I wanted to show you in this, is that it's titled that, and then underneath it, its producers are referred to as Rem Koolhaus and Ilya Zengelis with Madeline Vriesendorp and Zoe Zengelis. And for the first time, they claim that collective as the Office of Metropolitan Architecture. By the way, a very good passing strategy is put your tutor's name on your paper when you get to it. It wasn't because they were already practicing professionals. It was because it was truly a collaborative project on a new kind of modern architecture at the time. 2 years later, 2 years ago, Ben Reynolds, after graduating in AA Diploma 5, stood up and did the very same thing hundreds of students have done here, which is present his work, which that year won AA Diploma Honors, one of 4 students that year won that distinction in the school. Ben, by coincidence, is going to be back in the building next week, and on Monday, with Diploma Unit 5, present their agenda for that program this year. You'll get a chance to meet Ben and many other recent graduates who are here teaching today. The figure of the architect as we know it is one of 3 key parts of architectural culture. First, the figure of the architect. There is the work that we associate with that architect, and there is the thing that that figure writes or talks about or argues with that project. And it's the interplay between those three things and our belief in pursuing all three of those things simultaneously, which will explain how it's possible a little tiny school like this, sitting in these ramshackle old Georgian buildings, could possibly produce the range of personalities that you all know across the 20th and into the early 21st century. We believe deeply that your job is to understand not just the construction of each of those three things, to argue intelligently for architecture, to produce new and weird and unexpected designs. And this was a very weird project, as you all know, Adolf Loos's entry to the Chicago Tribune Tower. And of course, that person or that persona within architectural culture. And what we're obviously interested in is pushing and prodding you into a way to intelligently take command of all three of those realities in architectural life. There's nothing new to that story in architecture. The figure of the architect has always been a very knowing, very cunning, very carefully considered construction. This strange old German figure in the 1960s hanging out in Chicago, literally photographed within his architecture every time we see him. And what you're seeing recorded isn't just Mises' architecture. This is one corner of Crown Hall at IIT that he designs in the 1940s, but that figure itself emerging out of that architecture. So, simple first point, isn't the making of an identity architecture's only real project? You think you're here to do great projects. You are? But the project that matters most is the project sitting in these chairs today. And that's what you're going to be relentlessly interrogated, pushed, and prodded for. All of the focus in this place throughout the year is going to be the stuff that's pinned on the walls or sitting on tables. But the only reason we're interested in all of that stuff is because we know it's out of that work that you all will emerge as figures. In fact, the way this place is organized, most of the time nothing could be harder than trying to do an intelligent project here because of the number of side swipes and out of left field questions you're going to be asked. But all of that is about testing you and pushing to your limits how it is you can take the ideas of your architecture, relate them to the projects you pursue, and out of that construct the figure of the architect as we'll know you. One of the neat twists of the AA, and I hinted at it earlier today, is that we don't see our job as primarily making an architect. I think that's the huge mistake most architecture schools make. In a way, that's the one given for any architecture school around the world. People come in, they train, they become architects, they go away, do great things. What we're interested in is that form of transformation of your lives in the middle of an incredibly public and open discussion, debate, interrogation about where architecture wants to go. To do that, we've got to put you within audiences of all kinds, which will start in the little units that you sit in one part of the school. We'll expand out to open presentations that we have when people from around the world come in and you attend juries, present your work in open week and that kind of thing. At the end of the year, after being seen by all of the tutors, your work will be examined by external examiners who are flown in as one last pass in terms of what's sitting within the portfolio. But that public making of audience is the one really interesting component to this school. We believe deeply in the importance of that kind of activity. It's the place where you can test yourself. It won't be about having a clear, good, interesting, unexpected idea. It will be about taking that and finding a way to argue it and communicate it to people in rooms like this. And you're going to get endless opportunities to do that. It's happening in weird ways today, as you can see from a picture like this. A shot that was snapped a couple of years ago of me and a few tutors and a student sitting in a discussion of their work in a presentation downstairs in the lecture hall. Because we're relaying that kind of a discussion to different parts of this building or streaming it online live to audiences that might be halfway around the world, you have all this sort of strange appliances filling these sort of rooms now. And it isn't a single audience anymore, it's a series of nested multiple audiences. Again, something for your generation to take control of, to comprehend, to push to its limits, that's simply a part of architectural life today. I think one of the funniest qualities of it, if you look at this picture, is nobody even knows quite where to look in a presentation, right? It's like everybody's like, the project's going to sneak in from outside and, jump on us. But again, an incredibly interesting question. But by opening that sort of core activity of any architecture school deliberately to a much more complex testing of what we think of as an audience, you have the opportunity to test and understand what it really does mean, not just to form an idea or invent it, but to really communicate that in ways in which you can do what everybody here is going to want to do, which is to make architects think in fundamentally new and interesting ways. You do that by simply looking at the world in a strange way and having the confidence that that's the beginning of any number of those careers you think you know of well that have come out of this place. You do it, kind of an odd picture, you do it by compiling an architectural world in which the distinction between your portfolio and your person becomes a really difficult one to understand. Your portfolio is an extension of that form of discovery and invention in a project. It's a word I'm going to come to in a minute in our life. But what happens over the course of the centuries is that the architect we think we once knew, who is actually this particular architect, Andrea Palladio, is the architect of an AA student's home outside of Venice, in which 500 years later, a figure like Cedric Price, who graduates here in the 1950s, ends up exhibiting his work and creating what you have to admit is a very goofy version of what the architect by the 1970s and 80s was becoming. Amongst my props, and because you'll be seeing it later this year, Cedric's career is going to be presented here throughout the year in different forms. We've been working for the last 3 years on the first comprehensive monograph of the world-changing career of Cedric Price, which began in 1952 before he graduated from the AA and ended in his death in 2003. And we have an 800-page compilation of his ideas and projects and texts that are going to become the basis for several events in the public program this year. So that was my working title for this first part of the talk, The Architect is Project. I pulled out one image out of thousands we could have picked of an AA student, what I thought was a very memorable AA student summary of that life as an architect as she imagined it a few years ago in a single image, which took her 6 weeks to construct in a hotel room over here in a place called My Hotel around the corner. She rented a hotel room and staged this large format photograph to try and capture the different stages of what she imagined her life is going to be over the next several decades. There's a bit of deal making, there's a bit of belief in the world, there's some unexpected stuff happening here, there's a bit of distraction, and of course at some point the opportunity to look back and reflect on that career. I'm not going to tell you which student in there was the person who actually constructed this image. But the interesting thing for me is that it recorded this instinct you all have that your world demands your construction of what you think that career will be. So what I thought I would do is just very quickly hammer through from A to Z, AA to Z, some of the funnier words that you all are going to start hearing routinely. Not funny ha-ha so much as sometimes funny strange. Strange words. Words that mean different things in these buildings than they do in different parts of not just the British Isles, but around the world. AA Inc. would be the obvious place to start. We were incorporated as an association in the 1920s with exactly that kind of activity happening in that very room downstairs in the lecture hall where some of you are seeing this presentation, where people started to come together as the idea of modern architectural education emerges, which it does in the first 2 decades in this country. The AA is amongst the oldest schools of architecture in the world. The profession modernizes and gets to the point in which we as a school separate from the profession and start to create a model for teaching and working differently in an educational setting. It was begun with incredibly high-minded moral impulses in the 19th century, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in this, but with a very simple belief in the role of design and being honest in the world. Like the two most unreliable things you think you could ever imagine that the AA evolves out of. And in fact, it begins really with figures like this, who is the first maybe celebrity celebrity figure lecturing in rooms like this at the A. That's a fellow named John Ruskin, whose acolytes included people like Walter Crane, great Victorian arts and crafts graphic designer, creates our first emblem, monograph, identity as a school, and who were central figures in a project of arts and crafts moralism in art and architecture, which will go a long way to explain some of the things that end up happening in this school over the years. We're obviously quite different as a school today than we've been in the past. We no longer confine ourselves to these wonderful old buildings here. In addition to all the various outposts we have in the world, we'll do things like this, which is just test the limits of where and how a school should operate today. We advertised a few summers ago, amongst a few friends, an evening lecture series that happened under the Millennium Bridge, going from St. Paul's to Tate Bankside, and astonishingly, crowds showed up, sat down as we did things like relay videos from the 1970s. That's Rainer Banham in one of his talks on Los Angeles. And that breaking of boundaries in a school, you could say, is one of the really interesting kind of core projects within the A school today. B for Bedford Square, a place you've now finally found. The only remaining intact Georgian Square in London, ironically, survived the bombings, which included, during the war, these buildings on this side of Morwell Street, all of which were wiped out, and by a few meters, these buildings somehow magically remained. Bedford Square is still, you could say, the mothership and home of a worldwide school today. It's a place we've been in now for almost exactly a century. Many of you in this room will join us for a centennial in 2017, which is the 100th anniversary of that picture, which is when we scrapped together a bit of money and bought one of these Georgian houses and have grown the school ever since. This is the school today, and those funny floor plans that you were given in your welcome packs this morning. This is the school that I inherited a few years ago when I took over the directorship of the school and came to a fairly obvious conclusion that we weren't all together, and we ought to be. We've been very lucky to put together a group of buildings, which is now your home for however long you're here with us in the school. And one of the current projects we're focusing on is now the sort of stitching together of all of those buildings, which required nearly 2 years of arm twisting with English Heritage and the Georgian Group and other heritage police, to allow us to make the changes we feel we need to make to create a school for you all that you really need in the 21st century. That's us. Down here, that's the history of architecture schools at the same scale, starting in the 1850s, that have slowly evolved into the kind of school we are today. I made this snapshot. We were a school of 650 students. The Beaux-Arts in the 1870s was a school of 650 students in Paris. Schools are evolving technologies. We embrace that reality. We are not a building type. We are an open experimentation of how to organize and use and change space. We are much more like this in our view of architecture. And it's funny because it's an image that's worked like up until the iPhone 6 arrived, and now it's like, you know, I'm going to start like going up like this. I don't know what to do. But the point is, we treat a school of architecture as a malleable entity, deliberately. We can't actually, this is a wonderful fifth-year student from a couple of years ago, George Massoud, who won AA honors with the proposal to open up the AA in new and exciting ways. He didn't actually, from the back, that's not actually a hole in the front members' room, as much as I would love to have done it. It's his one-to-one rendering of that part of his project, which was an opening up of one part of the school to the library behind it, in which he found, weirdly, not the library, but the library at the AA in the 1940s, which you can kind of see rendered there, and which he then walked through to start a conversation, not an AA graduate, just to make clear, a fellow named Le Corbusier, Swiss architect, who the AA students invited to this school for the first time in 1947. I am friends today with one of those students who is in his early 90s, mid-90s by now, and who stuffed a few pounds and a nice letter into an envelope and invited Corb to come over and give a lecture to AA students, his first ever visit. My predecessors, the faculty of this school, had forever forbidden French modern architecture to come in. AA students had a different idea. C is for complementary studies. For undergraduates, it's one of those worlds that are here to support you in your unit studies. Complementary studies are things like media projects, histories, theories, forms of contemporary professional practice, all of which occur in many different forms in weekly classes with new and strange media, not so new and strange here, to let you test different sensibilities and ideas through the vehicles that produce architecture, which are the different kinds of media, especially the portfolios evolve out of. I touched briefly on this earlier, so I'll skip through it. Democracy is a real thing here. It's part of our Victorian industrial age heritage at the AA. The AA was formed as an open membership society in which everybody who is a member is and will be forever treated equally. That student presenting, Jan Willem, presenting a few years ago his final project downstairs in the lecture hall, who is now an AA member and will be exhibited this year downstairs, is one of the thousands of people, all of whom don't just get comfortable presenting their work to others here, but engaging in the kind of audiences that in turn then end up having the discussions and interrogation of what projects are. You are all treated equally in that process. I moved away from a graduate studio here in this school to directing the school through an extensive discussion and debate about the future of architectural schools and where they should be going in the 21st century. The argument I made then and continue today is that architecture schools are relics. They are fossils of the 19th century, and like newspapers, they will die or be overtaken by new forms of communication, learning, understanding, which the AA is in an incredibly unique position to engage. The reason for that is that it's just us in this room. We aren't a university. Maybe you all know that by now. It will become very apparent very fast that we're nothing like a university. We are entirely independent and autonomous, and if we think there's something interesting to work on, and by we, anybody within this school, an argument is made and put forward, a motion passed, a project is brought in, a new kind of unit, program, project unfolds. And that's really the history, particularly the modern history of this school. On to E and evening lectures. I've already said it, go to them. Won't dwell on it here. They start with this first talk tonight. They're going to be going on nearly every night of the academic year. You will find weeks in which 2, 3, 4 evening lectures will require you either sheepishly hiding out away from everyone or finding a way to step out of the units and the programs to come join them. These, by the way, are some fairly busy people around London who do that same thing. So don't tell us you're too busy. Seriously, you won't be going to all of these. You don't want to, but what you want to begin to do is to curate your own interests and agendas. One of the ways you do that is dipping in and out of a range of not only the great and the good, but sometimes the people you don't know. Don't be tempted by celebrity life in architecture. It's a little world, architecture. They're little figures that are monster celebrities that are known by about 12 people around the world that you'll want to meet and you'll get to see and talk to and discuss things with. But the point is to get to the people you don't know and the projects you haven't seen. Find time. It's incredible what you're going to remember a few years from now from that experience. Typical AA students, by the way. This is 1952, gobsmacked by an evening lecturer out in the square. Get past that sort of project and look much more at these sort of figures, people you don't know and will have never met. This is an ingenious friend of mine who 30 years ago commissioned a young and unknown AA tutor to build what is today a modern masterpiece in Saint-Cloud in Paris, a beautiful little villa by an office in Rotterdam, and who came in to give his version of the story of that project. Not the famous architects, not the engineers, but his role as a client in creating the circumstances where a house like that could emerge. There are going to be lots and lots of opportunities for you to see people like that. E for external examiners, I've mentioned them already. Figures that come in at the end of the year to look at your work one last time after all of the internal assessments and discussions, which is helping not only you as students, but also us as teachers, figuring out where the school should go. Fantastic group of people that fly in every year from around the world. Spend 2 long days with all of the 3rd year and 5th year portfolios. Spend an entire day and a half with every one of the graduate students' works in the school and sit down and really look from a distance at where we are as a school and what we should be doing and what might be next in terms of where it's going. On to F in first year. Any first years in here? Let's see. Awesome. Quite a few of you in here. An amazing, for the rest of you who don't realize, these are people that will be with us here in the school for the rest of this decade. Just so, I guess the word would be just pace yourself. You're in for the long haul. I think one of the most interesting questions today is how do you possibly start a career in architecture with architecture changing the way it is? You've got a fantastic studio and other spaces below us where you're going to sit in the center of the building with everybody looking in, not to put pressure on, but with the belief that we're all there in some way to engage in that studio. We've reconfigured these buildings in many ways, but in one important way, by putting first-year students in the heart of things, you get to know the place from the inside out. By the way, this year's first-year class will graduate, many of you will graduate, in 2020 on exactly the 100th anniversary of the AA diploma. Not that there's any pressure on that. It's going to be great. Hook Park, just mentioned, so I'll skip through that. Everybody here saw Martin present Hook Park? Yeah, idyllic looking. Picture that as architecture school. What do you do with that as a kind of setting? And I'm sure Martin said it, but the key thing for us is the idea that a school isn't just a thing that sits in a singular city, or in fact, it needs to be thought of entirely in terms of the dialogues around urbanism in the city, but in fact can engage the complexities of that kind of landscape, which I always like to say, and it doesn't look like it, is the most modern part of the AA you will ever encounter, because everything in this picture is about 60 years old. All of the woodlands in this country were cut down during the war and have grown up since. So it's a relatively youthful scene compared to these old buildings back in Bedford Square. Anyway, what we've really been doing more than anything is testing not only the connection between design and build cultures, but with the idea of what architecture models become when they become big enough that you live and work in them. I.e., what happens when you make a model that can be measured by the ton and not by a scale on a ruler. So this is one of those first projects that we built, which then in turn becomes the home for building building-sized components and prototypes that we can then test in future buildings out on the site. Important word for next week, for the undergraduates, especially in years 2, 3, 4, and 5. So today, 2, 3, and 4. You're going to go on an interview next week with your unit masters, in which you will sit down and talk about the ideas that you're interested in for the year. After looking at all of the presentations, you're going to select a couple, put them on a list, and get an opportunity to sit down with the portfolio upstairs and talk to those unit masters to find a home for the next 32 weeks. I'll say a little bit more about that next week as we begin the introductions. But the most important part of that is that it's a kind of exchange between you and the tutors, finding the right setting for the kind of ideas you want to pursue, and in turn them finding a group of people that want to push the limits of whatever agenda they put in their briefs. Legacy, yeah, long one. Long, tiring, serious, accomplished legacy at the school. It's probably the worst thing for a school to have, for the sheer hesitation it tends to put in people as they walk into such a place. It's an incredibly rich thing, obviously, that so many unbelievable architectural minds have been formed here, from back in the old days to more recently. Your job is to instantly make all of that irrelevant. One of the things we worked really hard on in the school the last few years isn't just showing some of that past, but the way in which that's evolved into things in almost unexpected or unrecognizable form most recently. So it's a series of rooms that are just filled with the history of figures like this. For those of you downstairs listening, if you look at that long wall facing the square, that's Walter Gropius standing right in the middle of it. lecturing us all on what modern architecture should be. The most interesting part of the picture for me always is this young AA student totally ignoring that old German master. Everybody recognize who that is? Does anybody know? In 1955, who? Who? Yeah, Cedric Price, the year he graduates. Clearly distracted, thinking about something else. As Cedric is here 2 years later, with Lord Snowdon and the Queen's sister, who were out here on this terrace you were just standing on as they came in for one of the end-of-year parties. Cedric is already looking at the fireworks that are about to start. Word or two about London. One way to explain the city is that we are and try and be as much like this strange English city as we can, even though we often ignore it to a fault. London is, for better or worse, the capital of the early 21st century in many unexpected ways that I would say that even the English don't deserve. A lot of accidents have to happen for things to come together the way they do. We are all over that city in different ways, not just through the projects that our graduates, our former tutors, former council members, current teachers and council members have done over the years. But of course, if you look around you in this room, you are exactly like this incredibly global international city of London today. There is no city even remotely as multicultural and diverse as London is in these early years of the 21st century. It's a weird, strange thing, which we're going to talk a lot about, I'm sure, over the year, but it's something to embrace. We certainly do as a school. We have been in the form that we're in today as an international school now for over 40 years, when we were kicked out rather abruptly of the English funding of higher education, and we had to scrap around and start to find students like you and me from around the world who wanted to just come in and sit down next to other people, and it's something we continue to believe in deeply as a school. One of my favorite maps of London, this is an average Tuesday morning's arrival and departure from Terminal 2 to Terminal 3 at Heathrow. A kind of constant movement of bodies through the city, which, by the way, far outnumber those of us that live here. Something like 75 million people will move through London this year. 9 million of us call this place home, more or less. This city has rapidly reconfigured itself over the last 20 years into a setting that can accommodate that sheer movement of ideas and people and cultures to a phenomenal degree. This school has too. We relaunched the unit system the very year that Heathrow opened as the world's first long-haul destination in the early 1970s. And light bulbs started going off that people could move in and out of a school like this and engage in projects and teaching. This is the sort of picture I've long used as a model for what a school should be, more like an airport than a destination, a place where people come together for weird, brief periods of time to develop ideas and work before going off to some other world. Until as recently as the 1990s, this was our patron. She is no longer the patron of the AA. She wrote a letter and said she was done with us. We suspect her son had something to do with that. Prince Charles has never been a huge fan of modern architecture. But the most interesting feature is really that this city is a place where neighborhoods would compete with Hollywood's largest celebrities for the identity of who and what this place is, right? Where Notting Hill can stand as large as Julia Roberts or any number of others. At the flip side, a photograph I took a few years ago of my neighborhood up in North London, the day after the government closed down a mosque around the corner from where I live, in which, with unbelievable speed and clarity, people simply reprogrammed the space of the city to use it in the very same form as the building that the government tried to close down. It's an incredibly ingenious, fast-moving city. O is for one-to-one. In the most straightforward way, in a school that's organized around the production of portfolios and projects, that exchange between a student and a teacher, which you are going to begin a route on next Monday, is the continuum that organizes our entire year. The constant tutorials, arguments, cajoling, that end up producing the projects. P for portfolios, hugely important word. For those of you in interviews next week, remember a portfolio. Bring it with you to your interviews to show your tutors not just what you do, but how you can talk about that work and what you're interested in doing. Maybe the one thing for this intro to mention is simply that portfolios, as we know them at the AA, come in many, many different forms. Sorry. Sometimes thick books, sometimes big billboard-sized drawings or prints. We get these portfolios in front of you in many different forms throughout the year. In week 6 of the autumn term, we're going to bring back portfolios from last year for you all to look at in our first open jury. We exhibit them constantly. We obsessively collect and collate them and use them as the basis for extracting material within different parts of the school. They become the centerpiece, of course, of the other great activity in this place, which is people standing here like me and presenting where they are on projects and what they're doing. That's it right there. Like, that's the plan of the school. Do some work and present it to an audience. And argue it and believe in it, amend it, correct it, ignore what the person is saying, argue with them, whatever it is, it's going to require that you stand there with that work to defend it. And that's really the one thing that drives through all of these different courses you'll see. I put up 2 pictures of my own personal biography and trauma of that experience. And we all have our own traumas. My 5th year presentation I did in the diploma school here with my teacher on the left up there, Peter Cook, Mark Fisher, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, who I'm sure some of you know for being the architect of Mick Jagger and U2 and everyone else in the rock and roll industry, which he became the world's first great stadium rock architect. Frank Newby, a fantastic structural engineer, Piers Goff, and a sneering, just to use Cedric one more time, sneering, and it's the sneer that I remember more than anything 25 years later. We all will have our own version of that story here, and you're going to hear it over and over again for the way in which that discussion and debate will shift the way you think about your own projects. But in the center of all of that is you getting very used to the idea that that is how, in a school like this, architecture is learned and communicated. That's it, right? And that's why when architects die, architecture projects sometimes die with them. It is a field shaped by how we can argue and perform what we think the ideas around architecture and space and structure in the city should be. These rooms will be full of people doing that throughout the year. At the end of the year, that all gets collected into something called Projects Review. There'll be some pictures in the prospectus of how we then bring audiences together around that work. The entire school is torn apart and turned into a gallery. We then spend the rest of the summer rebuilding it so we can start an event like today. In fact, we'll look like a construction site through most of the spring as we tear the place apart so that we can put all of your work out on display for people to come in and see. People will test the limits of that installation. You'll be invited to try and walk across. That was out here on this courtyard back in my days as a student. And then, of course, people brought in, including many people outside of the school and even architecture, to look at it and to celebrate what you all do. Another way we try and build those audiences is through this relentless kind of paper practice of producing and publishing your work in relation to audiences, not just here, but around the world. We are a kind of paper mill, weirdly. It would be a separate talk entirely about the role of books within architecture, but it's something we believe in deeply. And if I were to make a model of the AA buildings right now, it would be this kind of an annual exercise we do where we compile all of that material into a single collectible set, which is all of the stuff that we've produced that's getting the work of the school out through all of the juries and other events in the public program. Each of those, you'll see in coming days as you get to know the bookshop, you'll see a series of monographs that are dedicated to units, programs, projects, including some of the most astonishing figures in architecture today, all of whom want to carry on that very same project with us through the publications stuff next door. And when I show it in the contemporary form, the point I always like to make is, look, this isn't anything new in the life of a school like this. Our Victorian ancestors were doing exactly the same thing. The technologies are simply evolving, and you learn to take command of technologies as they exist in your own time. As for studios, we've got lots of them now running through the building. One of the reasons that floor plan grew the way it did in the AA in recent years was so that each of you in the different design parts of the school can have a home here, and we expect you and want you to be here throughout the week, constantly. What we call the space of the design studio today, as many of you already know, is incredibly changed from what it was as recently as 20 years ago, as information and other technologies have rolled across the discipline. The kind of continuous information space of the architect's studio is one reason why architects are starting to look and act quite different from some of their predecessors from not so long ago. This is an exhibition I organized a few years ago where I took 3 or 4 of my own students and put them on exhibition down in the front members room for a month, where they sat one July to show not the work we were producing in the studio, but how strangely they work today as a collaborative design team across electronic and other networks. And sitting in the middle of those studios are things called tables, which are different in AA language in that they are the moment in which a portfolio goes down at the end of the year for your tutors to assess. But for many of us was probably the most traumatic single day of our AA lives, when a year-long portfolio goes on a table like this and 6 tutors sit down and very simply decide whether it's pass or fail. You have 10 minutes to present 32 weeks worth of work. Something that's been going on many, many years in exactly that form throughout the school. So in each one of these pictures, that end-of-year table has a student presenting to a half a dozen tutors who collectively, and this is the genius of this learning model, collectively make a decision. This is not a school where your tutor will decide if your work passes or fails. He or she, alongside you, will present and argue what that work is and why, but one of the most interesting features of that assessment is that it requires all 5 people to come to a collective decision on it. One reason why, obviously, your ability to communicate and present that work matters hugely in the life of this place. One reason why so many people leave here with the certainty and the authority and the command to present their work in that form for the rest of their lives. You're going to start it next week, and it's going to be a part of your life here for as long as you're around the place. It's exactly what an architect will do throughout his or her career. Your job is to keep your tutors from looking too bored most of the time. This is what I used to call the Marissa test. Marissa would nod off halfway through, and you would lose that ability to capture her and to train her mind towards that work over the course of the year. I love this picture, time management. In a year-long agenda-driven unit system, not just the first years, but everyone is in it for the long haul. You are here to start a project next week that you're going to be working on until next June. Some of you longer. You'll find out next week. Taking command of time is one of the things that I'm probably most animated about. For a species like architects who think everything is about space, I like to remind you that taking command of that space that you work within over the course of an entire year is one of the great assets of a unit system. You're not going to be running through a dozen different projects over the course of a year. You're going to lay the groundwork for an argument that gets tested, developed, presented, twisted, tweaked, developed into its final form, presented next autumn. You'll do that with your tutors, a strange bunch of people around here that you'll get used to very quickly, who usually, like Anne and Franklin, move in pairs for reasons that are difficult sometimes to explain, but I think sometimes for support, because you guys are so tough on them that they sort of need a partner around them. Units will always have a couple of tutors. Almost always there'll be a couple of tutors that lead a small group of 12 students. It's quite focused, quite intimate, the contact is relentless. Usually twice a week you're going to be tested on what you're producing throughout the year. And what you'll get next week are, on Monday and Tuesday, are people like Christina and Efren standing up and presenting their year-long agendas. That's what you've seen snapshots for in the prospectus. They've got 25 minutes next week to present that more thoroughly. You'll get a chance to then sit down with them or someone else you might select for an interview in intermediate or diploma school. And with that all getting sorted next week, we get on with the year-long work. Just coming to the end here, unit trips, lots of them. That distance to the moon and back that I might have been talking about earlier that you all have traveled will get compounded significantly as we carry out something that started with the Victorians here. This is the AA in an exotic place called Norfolk in 1912. We travel by coach and carriage to the north or stand on the roof of St. Paul's, in which today people go far and wide for things like latest interesting projects by architects you know, or to realize a small project in rural India or many, many other places. A group of my students with me in the tuna auction in the tuna market in Tokyo. A group of students in intermediate school at the time who hopped on the top of a bus and drove through the rainforest until they ran out of money. We had to find a way to get them back. Recording an amazing infrastructure of 2 or 3 person oil fields which are running the local economy. A Diploma Unit 7 a few years ago, who had as a brief the building of a new cinema for a small village that had never had electricity in Ethiopia. The design constraint being that they had to make it fit their carry-on luggage at Heathrow to get it through. And that sort of overseas activities connects to the other part of AA life today, which is something we call the Visiting School, which operates this year in about 50 cities worldwide. We sit in Greenwich Meridian time, right up there in the British Isles. By the way, one of the great British inventions is that they own time. They put the Greenwich Meridian time right through London. But that we then spread throughout the year in what we like to call a kind of longitudinal school today, that no longer sees itself defined by a single point in space. As you all know, having come in from some of these parts of the world to operate here, that we then reverse that in our visiting school every year, undertake a series of design workshops and projects in places all around the world. Access we gained a couple of years ago to the rooftops of Chernobyl to record what's happened to that city since an astonishing nuclear accident in the 1980s. One of the larger scale prototypes in Mumbai, a little flexible pavilion in Sao Paulo recently. Photograph we took a couple of years ago in Koshi-Rakura in the mountains in Japan, where the AA has been working for nearly 20 years with students from around the world, rebuilding all of the little structures of this slowly decimated village on the mountainside. Towards the end, W for workshops. You'll find them downstairs. There'll be introductions this week. There'll be noise and sparks and these, kind of smelly and messy at times. Alongside things like metal and woodworking workshops today, experimentation with things like 3D printing and the technologies today that are making workshops suddenly incredibly interesting spaces alongside units and studios. Activity that carries on out at Hook Park, as Martin showed you in that introduction earlier, to realize projects at, again, a large-scale prototype form, which we then bring back and display to public audiences here. Long time history of that here at the school, where if you believe that you will learn architecture by doing it, at some point you need to test that stuff with audiences in places like here in the square. There's a young group of architects called Coop Himmelblau in the 1980s, and that we gave a little bit of steel and glass to erect their first sort of large-scale installation, and which we use as a prototype in turn for the sort of activity that we've been doing in the pavilion series out here in the square in the last few years. Concrete, steel, wood structures that we then put out for public audiences here in the square. Yeah, I've gotten to the end. Zaha always gets the last word somehow. You will find this out. Said for Zaha. Two pictures I thought I would show you of her. First, what she looked like as an AA tutor downstairs not so long ago. She used to wear pajamas to school. I kid you not, like I'm not exaggerating that. This is a photograph that's been used many times over the years, but of her students' work exhibiting with her what they were doing in Diploma 9 that year in the diploma school. more recently, a few years ago, we invited her back to exhibit her work downstairs in the gallery, and she picked one project, which she was working on at the time, which is the Wolfsburg Center in Germany, and showed where her team was in that design work. This is about 2008-9, and what she did is she wrapped a full one-to-one scale model of that project through the gallery. And I wanted to show you that because the instinct that I find so interesting is that she did exactly what she was doing here as a tutor 30 years before that, when the school gave her an opportunity to exhibit the work of her students in the school. What they saw it as a chance to do was to test what they were working on at literally a one-to-one scale. So the floor of the gallery bends up and becomes the wall of the front members' room. The exhibition in her mind, and you'll find this running throughout the program, the public program throughout the year here, an exhibition like a book or a presentation isn't a place where people come in and show you what they've done, but a kind of live medium. So to bring it back to that point earlier about the AA school, the interesting thing is that in a school of architecture, the school itself is a kind of live material. And you're going to get many, many opportunities to see the ingenuity of how people have used that over the years. It's not about putting the work out and promoting it and publicizing it, however much some of that might happen. It's that as a school, we offer this place as a platform for people like her, 200 tutors today, or all of you as students to literally test what architectural space or structure should be. It's an incredibly interesting thing. So 30 years later, she comes back and she literally rolls the floor of the gallery up and across to become a one-to-one portion of that Wolfsburg project, which he and the studio were working on at that time. I'm going to wrap it up in the next 2 minutes. I thought I would just finish with 3 quick points, okay? Just a reminder, without quite the distracting picture. So, first point, simply the architect is a project, not a person. You are and will change, and the changing of minds is the hardest thing in the world we inhabit today. Our ability to change our own minds or to have faith that others are here to help us do that is probably the one thing we've all been conditioned to distrust. That is why the advertising industry spends gazillions of pounds every year trying to get you to switch from Pepsi Blue to Coca-Cola. They know how hard it is to change minds. Have faith that that's the reason you're here, and that's the one thing we can offer as a school, is a reinforcement of that. The architect as we know him or her has always, from the very beginning of architecture, been a construction. This is the etching that sits on the very first page of the only remaining book on architecture from antiquity by a young Roman architect named Vitruvius, who had the bright idea of writing it down. The first image in the 10 books, the first image in his collection of writings, astonishingly, is him at a jury, presenting his work to his Roman emperor and pointing to the models and drawings that he's produced. In doing that, he is literally representing and recording himself. So that's the reinforcement of the point I made earlier about the role and the responsibility you have to construct that and to not take it for granted. That has evolved and changed in many ways over the centuries or the millennia. That same figure, Vitruvian man, is rediscovered 1,000 years later, and weirdly, Leonardo puts him in the very center of the most iconic defining image of the Renaissance. In that case, it's the representation of idealized geometry. 500 years later, of course, modern architects in the early 20th century update that image dramatically in avant-garde, experimental European schools especially. This is one of those schools over in Dessau at the time, called the Bauhaus, and it continues to be updated today. This is a picture somebody just sent me of our Christmas party last year, where AA students are clearly still working on that project. You'll find many, many experiments with this question of the identity of the architect and how he or she operates. This is a wonderful former tutor that I mentioned earlier, Mark Fisher, when he was sitting down for interviews with students one year with a strange double that he had in the room with him to ask questions about what you wanted to do for the year. His knowing construction of himself as a part of that larger architectural project. That figure of the architect today is up for grabs. We don't know who you are There's a figure, and that's what you're here to construct as a part of that project. Second, very straightforward point is you've got to invent everything. It's not out there waiting for you to hunt it down like a piece of land or a territory or something. It will be constructed from the ground up, from the experience you gain in the school. Architects have been doing that for a very long time. The merging of their identities with the projects we associate with them. The difference today are the tools and the techniques and the ambition of doing that with the complexity of a world like the early 21st century. This is a single image that one fifth-year student constructed here 2 years ago. His entire year organized as one tableau, a kind of Renaissance fresco that represented every part of where he saw his career going. Once he successfully overcame his obsession with Mises' own career 100 years ago. It became a year-long exercise of interrogating and questioning and challenging Mies to the assumptions of what modern architecture should be. Last and very straightforward point is that architecture is always a realm of ideas. Don't think professional qualification as much as many of you here will become professionals. You will lead the profession in ways that you can't yet imagine. And the history of the school, this is one of my predecessors, standing up screaming at new students as they came in the 1880s and inviting them to enter the AA buildings and to then go out and join the profession. What becomes interesting in that project is how you construct your own work in relation to other architects, not just here, but around the world. One of my dear friends, Robert Venturi, his thesis project as a student, I thought I would show you a intimidating thesis project for today, one of the, I think, 3 great thesis projects of the 20th century. His final presentation of that work to his jury, this was at Princeton, to a great art historian who was his professor at the time, knowingly positions the design of a little chapel against those forms of architecture's past that for him mattered greatly. A kind of knowing construction, that's Bob, here at the AA a few years ago, in which he knowingly positions his work in relation to those around him, in turn for other people to come and follow that very same exercise. You will think you know AA graduates from the buildings they produce, and you do, to a degree. I wanted to put this image to show you that there's a bit of a family fight always in terms of where architecture might or ought to be going. But the thing to begin to pay attention to immediately is all of that stuff they do before they get to those buildings that construct the kind of spaces that let careers and ideas and projects unfold. All of the drawings, all of the imagery, all of the unbuildable stuff like walking cities that have filled this place over the decades that eventually evolve into the kind of careers that produce some of those kind of buildings that you've seen before. One of our great interests in the school is looking back at the way in which careers like Toyo Ito's have been formed out of first projects. It's a fantastic catalog, an exhibition here from a couple of years ago in which we took 24 of the most iconic architects of our time and asked them to show only that project that they began a career with. You'll see it downstairs in a book that we've got in the bookshop, but look at those projects for the sheer conviction that those people could get onto agendas and ideas and interests that they've been working on for 30 or 40 years since. And your job basically is to engage that kind of a project. These are the sort of things those people were doing when they were your age in the 60s and 70s, in which that kind of a figure sees its task the replacement of this kind of a figure. I think I'll stop there, everybody. Thank you. Thanks very much. As the representative said from Student Forum, I think we've got some drinks downstairs there. So everybody, and thank you everybody downstairs in the lecture hall, come on up to the bar and out on the terrace, enjoy drinks. We will see you tomorrow at registration. Have a look at the events list for the schedule and enjoy your week. Thanks very much.